Welcome everyone. This talk is titled A Complete Guide to OpenID Connect with OpenStack, which is definitely a very ambitious title. I don't know what was passing through my mind when I set out to try to achieve that. I don't think 30 minutes will be enough to cover that, but I hope to provide you a starting point for understanding how things are organized and for playing around with it yourself. And if you have further questions, then there's going to be time for questions at the end, and then we are available usually on the Keystone channel in IRC if you have more questions. I'll be around the conference if you want to talk to me more about OpenID Connect. I'm always, well, not particularly happy, but open to talk about it and to try to help you all with whatever you may need. So a bit about me. I am a senior software engineer at the MOC Alliance. This is a collaboration between the major universities in the Boston area. So think Harvard, MIT, Boston University. The last one is also my employer. We've been running OpenStack with OpenID Connect in some form or another since 2017. We usually use Keycloak as the IDP provider for that, and through that, we allow users of our cloud to log in to our OpenStack cloud with their institutional logins. So their Harvard email address, their MIT email address, their BU email address accounts work for authenticating into our clouds. I'm also a core reviewer on Keystone, and I was the Keystone PTL for 2 cycles, the Wallaby and the Victoria cycle. I'm also the chair of the OpenStack Technical Committee. So some very short definitions just to provide a foundation for understanding the rest of this talk. Authentication is the act of verifying a user's identity. Authorization is the act of granting access to specific resources. A token is usually a string that carries the user's authorization. This can be opaque, or it can be structured, it can be signed, encrypted. And finally, an identity, which represents a user. It's a machine or a human. That doesn't particularly matter. So what is identity federation? Identity federation is the ability to share identity information across multiple identity management systems. This can be within the same department. It can be even across organizational boundaries. The fundamental use case for identity federation, and probably the one you're most familiar with, is single sign-on. This allows a user to authenticate directly with the identity source rather than having multiple sets of credentials for each of the services that they're trying to access. The most common protocols for identity federation are OpenID Connect and SAML2. I'm sure you're all familiar with screens like this when you try to log into your favorite services, sign in with Google, Facebook, Apple. All of the big techs provide a way for services to use identity federation for users to sign in to their Spotify or their LinkedIn or whatnot with the account that they have with that big tech provider. So I'm sure we're all very familiar with this screen. OpenID Connect is what makes this possible. It provides a standard protocol that is built on top of OAuth 2, which is an authorization framework. OAuth 2 leaves a lot of things undefined and is usually mostly catered towards authorization. It doesn't specify how to represent a user's identity, and a lot of things that are necessary for having all of those different systems talk together in a way that they can understand each other. So OpenID Connect standardizes on an ID token, which is a JSON Web Token. It's in a JSON Web Token format. It contains the identity information of the user, and it standardizes on the format that the identity information of the users is going to be contained in that token. It also provides a user endpoint, a user information endpoint, which services can query with the user's token to get this representation of the user if they only have access to the access token, which is what OAuth by itself provides only, rather than the ID token as well. There's also different flows that define the interaction between the entities. So in this case, the most common flow that happens, especially in the screens that we saw before, is the authorization code flow. And the entities that usually take part in this interaction are, so a user, the relying party or the client, which will act on behalf of the user. The user will, through the client, authenticate with the OpenID Connect provider. It may also be referred to as an authorization server. This is the terminology that OAuth2 uses, or as an identity provider, and this is the terminology that Keystone or SAML2 usually use to refer to this identity source. And after the authentication has been completed, the client will receive an access token and an ID token for the user. And the client will verify these tokens either using cryptography or will query the identity server with the token to get more information on the user. And this is how a ID token may look like. All of the claims that are there are standard, so we may see that the email is verified, that my name is there. These are the groups that I'm a part of. The preferred username is my email address, and I have a given name, a family name, and again, an email address. So all of these are standard, and it allows the interoperability between different servers to know what to expect, in which field to expect. And why would you want to integrate your OpenStack with OpenID Connect? Well, the first case is obviously you have an existing identity and access management system, and you want to use the same thing for your OpenStack. You already have users, they already have their account and their credentials, and you just want to integrate into that so that they do not have to create multiple accounts. Another reason is you don't already have an existing authentication access management system, but OpenStack is not the center of your world, so you do not want to put those users in Keystone and not be able to access them from some other places. So you're starting from scratch, and you're starting to think about an ecosystem which is not only centered around OpenStack, but also Kubernetes or your other systems that you're deploying in production. And also, since it's a standard, like you can use tools that aren't built for OpenStack. We're not the center of the world, and there's so much more out there, and it helps to be better neighbors and implement those features as well, if we can. So if you want to use your existing users and your existing identity and access management system, you want to deploy, or rather, you want to configure Keystone as a client for your OpenID Connect provider. This will allow you to use it with OpenStack. It may be Keycloak, it may be Dex, it may be Azure AD. As long as it's compatible with OpenID Connect, it should work. Users can use their existing accounts and credentials, and these credentials are never going to be seen by Keystone. They're only going to be specified directly into the system itself. So this is how Horizon looks like if you have configured an OpenID Connect provider. So you're going to have a drop-down there that specifies Keystone credentials or whatever you name it. Here I've just named it as OpenID Connect. And once you click Connect, it will redirect you to your identity provider. In this case, for us, we use CI logon to interoperate with the in-common federation. So all of the universities are part of it. So in this case, if you click on the drop-down, you're going to see most of the universities in the US, and you can select your university, in this case, Boston University for me. And once you click there, you are redirected to the login page there, and even two-step, so MFA, and all of those things are going to work if you have configured them. And once you have authenticated, assuming you have access to a project in OpenStack, you're going to be let through, and you're going to finally see the dashboard. So let's go through that flow a bit more in detail. So a user authenticates in the identity provider. So you click on Horizon, you're sent to your identity provider. you access and authenticate there, and then you're sent back. So there are some things that happen here that start with Keystone does not perform OpenID Connect by itself. It relies on Apache and the mod auth OIDC that does this OpenID Connect flow and magic for us. And then once that happens, the user is there are going to be some claims available for Keystone to figure out what to do with them. So the information that is in the token is going to be passed on to Keystone. What Keystone then does is it locates or creates the correct user and updates the information of that user based on the received claims. And after that is done, it will redirect the user to Horizon with an OpenStack token, which is important here. It is still separate from the access token or the ID token that the user is going to receive from their identity provider, Keystone, and OpenStack still is its own world with regards to tokens. So all of the above is done through mappings. And the terminology that's important here is you have a mapping, you have an identity provider, and you have a federation protocol which ties the two together in Keystone. And for OpenID Connect, the protocol is either OpenID or mapped. This is what Keystone uses for specifying the authentication plugin for those two things. So you're going to start by creating an identity provider. This is the one that we're using. It's you have to provide a remote ID and a default and a domain for the location of users where they're going to be created by default once they authenticate. This is just a default for if you haven't specified something else in the mappings. Otherwise, that will take precedence. So then you create the mappings. I will go into more details in the mappings in the moving forward. And you finally create the federation protocol. All of these things are available through the CLI. You can query, you can list them, you can update them, you can delete them, and there's plenty of documentation about these specific things. And finally, you're going to add OpenID Connect, OpenID to Keystone Conf auth methods because that's the federation protocol that we specified. So we need to add that to the authentication methods. We talked a lot about, well, we mentioned a lot mappings in the previous slides. What mappings are, they essentially map remote claims into local attributes of the user. So in this case, you're going to have, for example, here's the mappings that we're using in the New England Research Cloud. You can see that there's two sections, remote and local. In the remote section, we have OIDC preferred username and OIDC email. And we see that in the top part, we have a 0 and a 1. And I have color-coded them to make it easier to understand which goes where. But this is what a mapping is. It maps remote claims into the attributes of the user. So in this case, once I have logged in, it will create a user for me. And if I query the information for that user, what I'm going to see is that there's a federated section there that mentions that my IDP is Keycloak. These are the protocols that I have used to authenticate, namely OpenID, and that's the unique ID that was passed as the OIDC preferred username. So whatever you specify as the name in the mappings is going to become the username of the user and the unique ID that the user is going to be defined by. There's a lot more that you can do with the mappings. You can specify conditions. These conditions can be either conditions to filter users based on the value of the claim, so any one off, not any off. In case a user fails this condition, they're not going to be allowed to authenticate. You also have conditions to filter the values in the claims themselves. So if you only want to map some of the groups that are in the identity provider to groups in Keystone, you're going to be providing either a blacklist or a whitelist to only filter out those values as necessary. And regex is also supported, so good luck with that. So here's one more example. In this case, we're also using groups. So you can see that now we have in the local section a groups field. There's also a domain there which specified in which domain to look for the groups, in this case in the default domain. And we are only whitelisting the developers and ops teams groups. So if a user comes in and they have developers, ops teams, but also, I don't know, client, then the whitelist is only going to let developers and ops teams into the groups matching there. It's not going to prevent the user from authenticating. It's just going to filter out the value that is extraneous and not part of the whitelist. So here's an example of regex, but also of the any one of condition. So in this case, we're only allowing users that, well, that should have been email rather than groups. It makes more sense. But so if I edit that out, instead of IDC groups, it's emails, then it's only going to allow people that have the yeah.com email address. And it's going to filter out the projects that have project dot as the beginning. So this is very powerful, and you can do a lot of things with this. Be careful. It's also worth mentioning a bit what a Keystone user is, because we saw in the previous slide that when I queried my user in Keystone, there was a field there that said federated, and then there was a list inside of it, and then another list. So a Keystone user is composed of multiple components, essentially. And a Keystone user can have multiple federated users. And all of these federated users are exposed through the API. So you can query users based on their unique ID, based on their identity provider, based on the protocol. But you can also delete those federated user components of a user, or enhance a user to also include federated user attributes. This essentially allows you to pre-create a federated user. This was a limitation of Keystone in a few years ago, where a user would only be created if they had already authenticated. So on their first authentication, Keystone would create a user for them. But otherwise, it wouldn't allow you any way to create a user before. But now you can. This is not in the Keystone client yet, so I had to do a payload in JSON. Hopefully, we're going to get it in the Keystone client soon. But this is what we are using to create users in our cloud. So we have a centralized access management system that creates the user and assigns the role on that user. And then when they log in, it's a significantly better user experience than the first failed authentication and then getting the users to have access to something. So obviously, you can also update and delete the federated pieces. So that was a good segue into authorization. So this only really talks about authentication. There are multiple ways that you can assign roles on a user that is coming from OpenID Connect. Obviously, as I just mentioned, these are users that you can query, update, delete. So you can also assign roles on them, put them in groups. Everything that you can do with a normal user, you can also do with a federated user. Another option is to carry groups through the mappings. I will talk a bit about more in the next slide. And the final option is project auto-provisioning. So when you assign group membership through mappings, we saw an example where we had OIDC groups and we had the ops and developers team. By default, these group assignments are only really valid for the duration of the token. So they're not going to be persisted in the database. Therefore, you're not going to be able to create trusts or create application credentials for them, as they're not going to be persisted and they're not going to be available to be acted at a later date for the user. There is a possibility to persist these group memberships for a limited set of time. So you can either set the default authorization TTL value on the keystone.com file, or per identity provider, there is an authorization TTL field in the IDP entity that I described before. So what this does is once a user authenticates, if they carry the developers group and they're matched to a developers group in Keystone, they will be members of that developers group for the value that you put here in seconds. And when they re-authenticate and they have that group again, that will be extended again for that amount of time. So this allows you to assign, to create application credentials, to create trusts, things that are necessary for actually being useful, because otherwise you would only be able to access things through Horizon. Another option is project auto-provisioning. So you can specify a project field in the local value of the mappings. One big caveat of this is that role membership is not going to be kept up to date. So if a user is granted a project and then they re-authenticate and the mapping would map them to a different one, it's not going to remove them from the previous project. So these are useful for simple things like giving someone their personal project. For example, in this case, we have a project section where we define a project with the name project40, and the 0 in this case would be mapped to IDC preferred username. So you would, when the user authenticates, if the username is K Nikolla, which is my username, they will also be created a project called project for K Nikolla, and they will be assigned the roles, the role member as specified there. Again, if something changes, that role will be persisted. It's not a role that will be carried only for the duration of the authentication or for a limited set of time. It's actually persisted there, so keep that in mind when you're using this feature. You are also probably going to have to access things through the API rather than through Horizon. Single sign-on is very catered towards web SSO flows, so redirects and all of those nice things work on the browser, but it's hard to do through the API. For example, in our cloud, like I have to be redirected to CI logon, and from that I have to be redirected to BU. It's impossible to really do this in a meaningful way without the browser. So there are several ways that you can deal with that. The first one is application credentials. I hope you're all familiar with that. They do work, and the caveat is that they bypass the external authentication mechanism. So if a federated user has created application credentials, they don't need to authenticate to the central identity provider anymore. So you should take care to keep those memberships, those role assignments up to date, so that if those are no longer applicable to the user does not have that access anymore in the OpenStack service itself, rather than only by disabling their account in the central identity provider. Another way is through OIDC password. So there's the resource owner password credentials grant that OAuth defines. This allows a user to authenticate into the identity provider by specifying a username and password. Your identity provider needs to support that. It's a special flag in Keycloak. But you can do that, and that will allow your user to access and authenticate to the IDP through the command line if you would like that to happen. And another thing that is fairly new is you can finally use the OpenID Connect device authorization grant. So that is something that you've probably encountered when trying to authenticate to, I don't know, Disney Plus to the TV. It will give you a one-time code that you're going to go authenticate into on your computer, put that code there, and your device is authenticated. Now you can do that via Keystone Auth. So Keystone Auth will support this. or rather it does support this, and you can authenticate through the browser and input the code in the CLI, and you have access to that. You can get this all running yourself. I have written a DevStack plugin that will set up Keystone with a Keycloak running as a container, and it's going to configure Apache for you. It's going to configure the identity provider and the client in Keycloak. And at the end of the run, you're going to have a Keystone that works and is authenticating through Keycloak. We've also done work to integrate the above into the testing gate that Keystone uses. So you can also do this through DevStack rather than through a special, or rather through the Keystone DevStack plugin rather than through a separate plugin, which is in my repo, and you probably don't trust me enough to run that. So I don't think there's a lot of time left, so I will go a bit more quickly moving forward. But all of the things that we've talked so far has been in using your external identity provider in Keystone. But there has been some work in making Keystone work as an OpenID Connect or OAuth server. So the first of those is Keystone now supports authenticating through the client credentials grant. So you're going to be able to have an application that is configured to, or rather written to use OpenID Connect, be able to talk to Keystone and get a token. There's also work that we just merged the last cycle that allows you to use OAuth 2 mutual TLS authentication with Keystone. So those are all exciting things that are getting Keystone to be more standards compliant rather than implementing things that are only really valid for OpenStack. And Keystone middleware can also be configured to receive a token through authorization bearer rather than through XAuth token, which it has always been doing. And all of this allows for some compatibility between your existing applications and clients that have been written for OpenID Connect and OpenStack. There's also a discussion that, and a spec that has been proposed in allowing Keystone middleware to support OAuth 2 token introspection. So in this world, Keystone middleware wouldn't be talking to Keystone as it has always done, but it would be talking to Keycloak directly or to your OpenID Connect or OAuth 2 authorization server. So if you're interested in that, the Keystone PTG sessions are going to talk about that. They're on Wednesday. Please look at the PTG calendar. Hopefully we can get into a world where the token that you get from external identity provider just works and you're able to cure Innova or Cinder with a token directly rather than having to get another OpenStack token. And a lot of the things that I mentioned aren't well documented or at all. I apologize for that. Some are under review, some have yet to be written, but we're working on improving the federation documentation. And we also really want to implement more features of an OpenID provider or authorization server into Keystone. And yeah, thank you. And I don't think we have time for questions, do we? Or we have 1 minute for questions. I'm sorry. Well, thank you.